Okay guys, this video is going to look at strength training, remembering our success criteria for this entire critical question of how do athletes train for improved performance is for you to be able to describe two types of training, their methods and safety considerations, for you to be able to design a training program for two different types of training and explain why this type of training will improve performance with reference to specific fitness improvements and how they can be measured. Now that's quite long, but that's the only success criteria for this whole critical question that we're looking at. Now, the learn to throughout this critical question is also the same, and so you're going to apply this to strength training and to any other type of training. The learn to is for you to be able to analyze two of the training types by drawing on current and reliable sources of information. You need to examine the types of training methods and how these best suit specific sports requirements or performance requirements. You need to be able to design a training program. You need to describe how training adaptations can be measured and monitored. And you also need to identify safe and potentially harmful training practices. So that's going to be our learn to the whole way through this critical question. Our learn about for strength training asks you to know about resistance training, weight training, and also isometric training. So let's get into it. Now, strength training, this is a general thing, it encompasses all types of exercise designed to improve strength or increase muscle size. That's because increased muscle size just automatically produces an increase in strength. Now, strength training programs have a large number of variables, so that can be things like repetition, so that's the number of times an exercise is repeated without a rest. There's things called repetition maximums, which is the maximum weight that can be lifted a specified number of times. So it might be a 1 RM that someone can lift once but not twice, or an 8 RM that someone can lift 8 times but not 9 times. There's also sets, which is a number of repetitions done in succession. For example, you might do one set of 10 repetitions, but you might do 3 sets with a rest in between. The rest is the period of time between exercises, sets, or sessions. And then, of course, people talk about the resistance, which is normally talked about in terms of the weight or possibly the load that's being used to cause the resistance in the strength training program. When it comes to resistance training refers to all kinds of different types of training. Resistance training can be weight training, it can be hydraulics, it can be elastics, it can be pretty much anything. But for your syllabus, really all it wants you to look at is hydraulics and elastics. Now, elastics are particularly good at developing power and speed, and so are hydraulics. Now, the main thing about elastics is that they're very versatile. You can use them anywhere. They're simple, but they're very limited because the resistance on the band it'll increase as the band is stretched. So it's not a constant resistance throughout your movement. But also the resistance, the bands don't go very high in terms of their resistance. You can get springs to form resistances, which actually they tend to be a lot more resistant than the elastics are, but still they're not going to go to the same kind of resistances that you're going to get from your weights or even from your hydraulic machines. Your hydraulic resistance machines, you can have a look at one just here. These machines will often have little air compressors on them so that when you're pushing or when you're pulling, you're actually compressing air within that, and that's the compression of that air is what's causing the resistance, and therefore the faster that you're moving, the higher the resistance becomes, and it will actually naturally slow you down, and so you're exerting the maximum force that you possibly can as fast as you can, and the faster you do it, the more you've got to push, the more force you need, and that's why hydraulics is really good at developing speed and developing power. We then come to weight training. Now, of course, weight training, as I mentioned, is a type of resistance training, and we have talked about weight training previously in factors affecting performance. Weight training is really a form of strength training that uses sets and repetitions. It uses specific units of weight to create progressive overload or progressive resistance, and ultimately the aim of it is to really strengthen and develop muscles. Weight training is very versatile. You can use it for a number of different aims. Most often it's used for hypertrophy or for strength gains, but it can also be used for power gains and for muscular endurance. So for example, if you're doing 1 to 4 RMs, you're going to develop power. If you're going to do 8 to 12 RMs, you're looking at strength. 10 to 15 RM, you're doing hypertrophy, and then 30 to 60 RMs, you're looking at muscular endurance. In weight training, the gains are very specific. They're specific to the muscles that are used, to the movements that are done, to the speed of the movement, and to the intensity of the lift. And of course, the intensity of the lift, that's your RMs, and they determine what your focus is for your training with those RMs that I just went through. Within weight training, there are things like machines. There's pulley machines, Nautilus machines, all kinds of different machines that have weight plates. Some you've got to load the plates on, some are pin machines. But regardless, there's lots of different types of machines or apparatus you can use for weight training. There's always going to be plates involved generally, so they're weight discs or plates that are anchored normally to a barbell or to a dumbbell. Then there's also your dumbbells and barbells. A barbell is a long one that goes the whole way across, whereas your dumbbells are designed for individual hands and both of them will normally have two sets of discs or a set of discs on either end. The next form of strength training is isometric training. Now, isometric training is static contractions. If you remember back to prelim, static contractions are the ones where the muscle is contracting but not changing in length, and that's isometric training. So in isometric training, it's particularly useful for any kind of sport that requires static contractions. That could be wrestling, martial arts, gymnastics, dance, all kinds of stuff. Isometric training, one of the negatives of it is that it is joint angle specific. That means that whatever angle that your joints are when you're doing your isometric contractions, so if you're pushing against a wall and you're not moving any further than, let's say, 110 degrees, that's where you're sitting the whole time, then that's where you're going to get your benefits or your maximum benefits from that training. If you then bend your arm further and go to like 80 degrees, you're not getting the benefits from your training. The best strength gains for isometric training is essentially going to be achieved by doing 6 to 8 repetitions and holding each repetition for 6 seconds. So that's an isometric or a static contraction for 6 seconds each time. One of the advantages of isometric training is that you can do it anywhere. There's no really any need for equipment, although you can do it with equipment as well. Very little time to do it. It's very valuable for rehabilitation. Really helps to overcome those sticky points or those weaker points in a muscle, and really very versatile. You can do them pretty much anywhere. Lots of disadvantages though. It does not increase strength through the full range of motion. It causes a rise in blood pressure. Speed can be reduced through isometric training, and other methods such as isotonic testing must be used in order to measure progress. So yeah, if you're testing using a 1RM, static contractions and isometric training isn't going to help your 1RM very much. Now let's have a quick look at this diagram here. This is really explaining the general adaptation syndrome that happens with training. So here we've got exercise that begins and it's going to fall down as exercise goes, and there's lots of stress happening to your body, and that's causing your fatigue. Once you stop your training session, your body was going to start to recover and it starts to go up over here. And then it's going to go hopefully past the point where your current strength level is into a new strength level. And it's at that new strength level, which normally is about 48 hours after you've done your training session. So that new strength level that you then want to have your next lot of training, remembering back to factors affecting performance and your principles of training, progressive overload. This is the kind of graph that we looked at. And here you need to make sure you're using it when you're thinking about training, particularly strength training. A strength training program would not be effective unless the program is exercise specific. So that means that you're going to do exercises that use the muscles that are specific for your sport, that do movements that are similar to the movements done in your sport, and are looking at resistances and speeds of those contractions that are also similar to those in the sport. Strength training really it requires the overload principle, so you have to make sure that you are progressively loading and doing that progressive overload within your training. Make sure that your resistance is continually getting higher as that adaptation occurs. In terms of measuring and monitoring your strength gains, a 1RM test is really going to be the best test for you. That can be quite difficult, particularly for younger athletes, because you're not meant to be lifting at that kind of intensity yet. And so what often people do is they'll do a 10RM test and then calculate the athlete's 1RM from that. You can also do things like skinfold measurements if your goal is to kind of reduce your body fat and increase your muscle mass, then skinfolds can be helpful. And also circumference measurements. Circumference measurements, those measurements where you get those very flexible measuring tapes. You measure around the top of the arm there, in the middle of the bicep and the tricep, see how big they are, and then do your training, see if you've gotten them any bigger. You can do the same for your chest, for your legs, for any muscle, just measure the circumference of it. And then later on you can compare your pre and post testing to see if you've actually grown that muscle. In terms of safety for strength training, Now, it's very important within strength training that you individualize the program so that you are actually looking at making sure you're addressing where the athlete is at and where you want them to go, not starting them higher up when they can't lift that high. You also want to make sure that there's no competition happening when you're doing your lifting. So you shouldn't have athletes that think, oh, how much can I lift? Can I beat you? That's not really the way that you should be doing your strength training. That's going to cause injuries. Make sure you've got a warm up, make sure you've got a cool down, make sure you've got correct technique, anything that's a high intensity. So weight training, and even when we get to anaerobic training, technique is very important for avoiding injury. You should not be using you should be using high repetitions and moderate loads. You should not be using high loads and low repetitions. Make sure that your equipment is all ready and safe and all those types of things. You should avoid bouncing with your lifting, and also make sure that you always are training with a partner. So make sure you have someone there who can spot you or someone who can at least assist you if you get yourself into trouble.